I really implore students in particular who may feel for some reason compelled to create rumors or to issue threats to contemplate the long-term consequences of their actions. And in the wake of a tragedy like was experienced in Florida, I think it's critical for students to understand the negative impact that has on their fellow students as well as the families in the community. And one of the maybe cliche statements that we make is, if students see something, they should say something. And our ability to deal with threats and to deal with appropriate discipline for those who make inappropriate comments or threats is only as good as the information we get. So again, I want students to consider the impact of the comments they make. And I think we as a district and as a community need to really work hard to make sure we foster a culture that won't tolerate that type of behavior. We have also had questions about how we report to our community when threats or potential violence occurs in our school buildings, whether they be verbal threats, whether they be social media related threats. We do have a protocol that we employ for threat assessment, and I want to be a little bit careful here about being too detailed in terms of the protocol, but I want to assure the public that we take each and every reported threat very seriously. In terms of our protocol, we do assess a number of factors with regard to each and every report we get. We assemble a team that includes administrators, school personnel, school psychologists, mental health therapists, if appropriate, and law enforcement. They take a look at a variety of factors that might come into play, and they'll assess those factors to determine the relative risk associated with any and all threats that are reported. It's important that that evaluation lead to interviews with the students, interviews with the home, determine whether or not there are previous incidents of behaviors that are concerning, whether or not there's access to lethal means, among many other factors that are assessed. And we do rely on the professionals. We rely on the community police as well as our school resource officers. And we do a very thorough and complete investigation of each and all complaints. And we then do rate that threat. And the outcome of any discipline or the outcome of any communication that we issue is really dependent on the level of the threat. And again, throughout the course of any given school year, we'll deal with many of these situations in the common course of our discipline operations within a school building. When we deem that it's a legitimate threat, when it rises above a low-level threat, there is communication that will be made to families and to the community. We also will involve law enforcement, and in each and every case where it's appropriate, we will make certain that not only are the appropriate supports put in place for the student, but that we deal with them through all available community resources. You know, our job is one that we take very seriously, and it's one that each and every day our school staff and our school administrative teams deal with. And I want to, again, assure the community today that our intent is to work as diligently as we can to create a safe and inclusive school environment. So we have many, many factors that come into play. In addition to assessing threats as they occur, I would like the community to understand that we do, unfortunately, feel compelled to train and to drill in the event that there are either actual threats or perceived threats that we need to address. We have worked hard to train our district staff in active resistance to provide them with the toolkit that's necessary for them to respond in emergency situations if necessary. We have statutorily mandated 8 emergency drills that we conduct in each school each year. Those would include fire drills or evacuation drills, lockdown drills, earthquake drills, and the like. And we take all that training and our drilling very seriously to prepare for emergency situations. We also, especially through our bond projects, are working to implement additional safety and security factors into each building. Those that we have been able to roll out thus far and those that we can accelerate in terms of their deployment will be a primary consideration of ours. That includes restricting access, locking exterior doors with the exception of designated entryways, creating entry vestibules and essentially welcome centers where we can control access to the building, providing staff with ID cards and card key access to our buildings, and eventually deploying card key access for students to access certain doors as they need to transition in and out of campuses. Again, this is work that we take very seriously, and we recognize that it's a tremendous responsibility, and the community vests some significant trust in us. And it's imperative that we work to communicate appropriately with the community with regard to our attempts to create appropriate environments for instruction to occur. And again, I think that parents often wonder what they can do at home, and the most important suggestion that I would provide is they need to communicate with their children. And I would encourage all parents not only to talk to their children, but to their family, their neighbors, to other members of the community. Provide support, provide affirmation, and work within the collective capacity of the community to affect positive change. I think that we as a community need to prevent a strong voice that rebukes instances of racism and intolerance, bullying, and fear tactics that lead to the kind of incidents that we've experienced all too frequently as a society. My commitment today is that we, as an educational institution, will continue to be vigilant. We'll try to be flexible and nimble and adapt to the needs of the community and the students and families that we serve. And again, our primary goal is to provide a safe and inclusive environment each and every day in each and every one of our facilities for each and every student. Thank you. Questions? Peter.
Mark, there have been several reports throughout the state and here in western Montana especially of threats or perceived threats. Do you see these mainly as what might be considered copycat threats of what has happened in Florida? I know that there are hundreds and hundreds of reports in schools throughout the country that are receiving these types of threats. I know it's necessary to take each one seriously, but how do you determine whether or not it's a really serious threat?
Unfortunately, I think after an event like that which occurred in Florida, we do see an increase in the number of reported threats of violence. The unfortunate reality is every single one has to be taken seriously. We simply cannot dismiss any as being copycat or invalid. And given that, we need to engage with law enforcement and, again, our school crisis teams and our threat assessment teams to determine what our best course of action is. What makes it challenging at times is we're not always able to identify the source, and that makes it increasingly disconcerting. And therefore, my previous reference about creating a culture, and I know it's an oversimplification, but a culture similar to that we see in airports, where we would just never expect this kind of threat to be spoken, verbalized, because we know that there's an impending and an immediate consequence. Just simply can't be tolerated.
Are the two graffitis related to each other, and are there any suspects or anybody that are in question?
They have been conducting some interviews. I would not say that we have any clarity at this point who authored them. I would suspect they're two different individuals. One was in a boys' bathroom and one was in a girls' bathroom.
School going to be scheduled to go on as tomorrow?
Absolutely. We're confident that we have done what we can to address the threats. We'll have increased levels of law enforcement and security at the building tomorrow, but yes, we will have school as scheduled.
Can you talk a little bit more about what an increased presence and security will look like at a school?
Well, for example, in each of our high schools, we have a school resource officer, and they're there full-time when school's in operation. For tomorrow, we've asked for additional law enforcement presence. So at Big Sky High School, for example, we anticipate 3 officers being present.
And how long will that extra law enforcement last, do you think?
You know, I don't have a clear sense of that at this point. We will evaluate on a daily basis.
When you say that you would like the vibe to be more like at an airport where nobody would say threats like this aloud, do you also expect that the school would have kind of comparable security and sort of that same tone of an airport where you have to take off your shoes and be thoroughly searched before you're allowed in?
You know, part of the challenge is schools really are community centers, and we want to be a welcoming environment for the students, the parents, the community. And yet at the same time, we need to have appropriate security measures in place. Striking that balance is a challenge for us. Part of our interest in passing the bond issue was making sure that we had essentially welcome centers and vestibules in each school so that we could control the traffic and channel it through a single entrance and actually have all visitors sign in and be appropriately vetted essentially before they enter the facility. So I wouldn't say to the degree that an airport would have, but I think in terms of a culture about expression of violence or threats of violence, that's what I would be referencing.
Why do you think this is happening now? I mean, this week. What can you tell us more about what about an event like what happened last week spurs more of these?
You know, I don't know that I have a clear understanding. As Peter referenced in his question, this is a phenomenon that's occurring across the nation. Certainly, we've seen it play out in our region and even in obviously our schools locally. You know, I wish I understood. I think it would go a long way to solving the problem if we could gain an understanding of why it happens. But again, I think our only response presently can be to take each and every potential threat very seriously and investigate it to the best of our capabilities.
What criteria does the threat assessment team use to determine that these threats were low-level threats? And
again, without getting into too much detail, part of it is interview with the team, the mental health therapist, whether or not the student has prior discipline, access to lethal means, the response of the parents or guardians through the interview process, and again, just the general type of comment or threat that was made. I think all those things are evaluated, and without getting into specifics about the protocol, we just need to be thorough and comprehensive in our assessment and really have a team come together and collaborate on a decision and make sure that we have consistency with regard to the evaluation and the recommended outcomes.
Mark, has it been impressed on the student population, the seriousness of any sort of vocal threat?
Absolutely, and that message will continue to be shared in the coming days. And I know, for example, a number of schools will plan specific statements and discussions to occur around this topic in the coming days.
Go ahead,
Does the district have any response to the walkouts that happened yesterday and the kind of students' own responses to these threats?
You know, in terms of the specific response to the walkout, first of all, I think that it is critically important to hear the student voice with regard to this situation. And my hope is that the students continue to express what they believe, that they do it in an appropriate and responsible fashion, and that they maintain maybe the momentum beyond just the events yesterday to truly try and affect change. I think their participation in civil discourse is truly critical. And I think maybe in some respects that's been a missing element in response to prior situations like this. So I applaud students for wanting to become active. That being said, obviously in situations like that, which occurred yesterday, we have to be concerned about safety of the students as they do leave the site and are out in the community when the expectation is they would be at school.
I got the sense from a lot of Big Sky students today that they thought that this was all a joke to get out of school. How do you communicate with them what is real and what is severe?
And that's a tremendous challenge for us, quite honestly. You know, it is somewhat like the boy who cried wolf. You do this too frequently, and students and staff may become dismissive of those threats, and that's really a travesty, because in the event there were a real emergency, you've lost the sense of urgency and maybe the responsiveness that you would want to have. And I think that's a message that the students need to understand. I do know that there were a number of students who were dismissive, but there were a number of students who were certainly significantly impacted emotionally. And we need to be ready to address all responses. And again, as I said previously, you know, we need to treat each and every one as though it's serious and make sure that we respond appropriately.
There's a history, a sort of documented history among people who go to these extremes of assault, of history of interpersonal violence and domestic violence, which often those patterns can start very early, and teenagers obviously are exposed to a lot of discussion about those dynamics. Is there any effort on the part of the district to sort of teach about those dynamics before they get to this crisis point, and to sort of help students be better informed about how to respond to things like that?
Absolutely, and we do have within our curriculum, in the health enhancement curriculum, specific lessons that are intended to get to the important tenets of mental health and relationship violence and those kinds of things. I would also say we have recently begun administering a depression screener in grades 7 through 10, largely as a response to the suicide epidemic, but it also informs us with regard to situations like this. We have within each of our buildings community and school-based mental health therapy teams, and we have them in each building to help serve the needs of all students. And so I think it's incumbent upon us to recognize that certainly school's primary function has been the academic side, but you really can't successfully deal with the academic needs of students if you don't also address the social, emotional, and behavioral needs of the students.
I know we're getting close to deadlines for people. Let's take the last two questions, if there are any.
Have you thought about putting any like police officers in civilian clothes, so that way it doesn't kind of put heightened security among the teachers?
You haven't considered that really. Our school resource officers sometimes are in uniform and sometimes are in less casual wear, usually school logo wear, that kind of thing. But part of our interest in having the resource officers in the school is to develop a positive relationship between the students and community law enforcement. So we want them to be visible, we want them to be able to interact, we want them to build a relationship. And it's no different with any other staff. I think the key to solving issues like this is having positive, healthy adult relationships with students in each and every one of our buildings. Having a meaningful adult relationship really helps foster a sense of security among the students in the buildings. Also gives them an outlet when they do have questions and concerns, somebody that they can trust to have those important conversations.
There was at least one media outlet that quoted a student as saying she had heard over the intercom or something that there was an active shooter.
And I know there were social media postings to that effect, but that was not accurate.
Yeah. How did that happen?
I wish I knew.
Okay.
It's the rumor mill, and unfortunately, I think all too often when it gets posted to social media, people accept it as fact, and it's not always accurate. Again, I appreciate your time today, and this is an important community conversation, and your assistance as media to get the message out certainly serves our community interests, so thank you. And at any time, if you have questions or concerns, please feel free to contact me.
Thanks, Mark.
Thank you, guys.